When I was 14, I wanted to be a shortstop for the Cubs. I mean, I was interested in baseball above all sports. I was good in school, but I mean, school didn't captivate me or books. I think the discovery of Aquinas the Summa was like the acorn stirring. And I sensed, even as a little kid, that I'd follow that trajectory, which indeed I have, to this moment, talking to you, that I became a priest and a theologian and a teacher and a writer and an evangelist. It all came from that. So that's why that's such a special book to me.
Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the host and the content director here at Word on Fire. Today we're having a bookish discussion. We're going to talk about Bishop Barron's favorite books. You're going to learn his favorite book of theology, poetry, fiction, his favorite stage play, and more. So stay tuned. But first, Bishop Barron, welcome to the show.
Hey, Brandon. How you doing?
Doing pretty well. Let's catch people up with some of the things you've been doing lately. In the midst of the COVID thing, most of your events and travels have been canceled, and you've been doing a lot of them through Zoom and Skype and things like that. And one exciting thing you just did was to interact with a bunch of Catholic students at Princeton University. Tell us about that.
Yeah, it was fun. I was invited to go out there and be with them in person, but of course that couldn't happen. So I just came here to the studio, and then we're on live on a Skype thing or Zoom or something with our own Leo Labrusco, who's active there, and then a lot of Catholic, I don't know if all of them were Catholic or not, but a lot of students from Princeton came on with really good questions, and we had a chance to see each other and talk, so I enjoyed that very much.
Yeah, give us a summary. What are some things on the minds of students at Princeton when it comes to God and religion?
Yeah, the ones that you find, I think, across the board. Is there a God? How do you show it? The problem of suffering. Some of them talked about more personal issues and evangelization and, how do you spread the faith? And in a culture that's so antipathetic toward religion, how do you live it and spread it? That sort of thing. In fact, I think that's what the main focus was, now that I remember, was more evangelization. But a lot of the standard questions that have beguiled human beings, from time immemorial.
Well, we're filming this episode a few weeks before it's going to release, but I wanted to talk about a couple of upcoming events you have as well. So one of them is you're addressing students at the Catholic University of America,
right.
And then you also have a big, exciting upcoming lecture. Maybe tell us about both of those.
Yeah, again, I was invited to my old alma mater, Theological College, which is on the campus of Catholic U. They have an alumni award every year, so they invited me to come and say Mass and receive the awards. I was really excited about that. Again, unfortunately, with COVID and all that, we had to turn into a virtual event. So what I'm going to do is respond to questions from the TC, we call it, Theological College community. They sent me in advance about 20. They're really good questions. So I'll be responding to those. And I think they give me the award virtually, so maybe they'll hold it up and I can smile through the camera.
They'll fax it to you.
They'll fax it to me. And then I think the next day I'm giving the Kenrick lecture. Again, I was supposed to be in St. Louis on the campus of Kenrick Seminary to give this annual lecture. I'll do it now from here. But I think prior to the lecture, we're having another session with the Kenrick students. Again, kind of an open Q&A type thing. So I enjoy that. Normally, I also enjoy being at these places. But, as you know, Brandon, travel is just so, we can do it, but travel is much more difficult now. So anyway, we're making progress.
All right, well, let's turn to the books. You and I love talking about books. I think almost every episode we're mentioning a book or a recommended title or something like that. A long time ago, I think way back when you were a professor at Mundelein, you compiled a list of your favorite books, your recommended books. We actually turned that into a PDF that listeners can download for free. You can find that at wordonfireshow.com/books, books with an S at the end. So wordonfireshow.com/books. Download the full list, and they're mostly theological books arranged by sub-discipline, sub-genre, but you also identified your 5 favorite books overall, period, your 5 favorite books. I'd be curious to know as we work through some of these if they remain your favorites or if any have supplanted them, but I thought we'd talk through each one of them. So I'll briefly tick them off, then we'll spend time on each.
Okay.
So you have the Summa Theologia of Thomas Aquinas, you have the Divine Comedy of Dante, you have the 7-Story Mountain by Thomas Merton, you have Moby Dick by Herman Melville, and then you have Macbeth by William Shakespeare. So let's start with the Summa. I think listeners are obviously familiar with your love for Thomas Aquinas and especially his Summa, but talk to us about the personal significance of this book. When did you first come across it? How has it shaped you?
I can tell you exactly. When I was at Fenwick High School and was introduced to one of Thomas's arguments for God's existence, I was so excited by that. I was all of 14 years old, and I can still see my yellow 10-speed bike. I rode from my house to the Thomas Ford Memorial Library in Western Springs, Illinois. And I was fumbling around, and I found Mortimer Adler's set of the great books. And I went through it, and he had 2 volumes on Thomas Aquinas. And volume 1 I took off the shelf, and I found, there is the famous arguments. And so I checked it out. It was a big book. It was this high, this wide. If I don't, I think we have it on the shelf here. I think Joe Glore found a copy of this. Anyways, big book, and I tucked it under my T-shirt, and I tucked the T-shirt in, and I was able to ride, home with the book. And it became, how would I put this, almost like a talisman for me. I didn't really understand it. I was 14 years old. I had no training whatsoever in philosophy or anything. I didn't know what 2/3 of the words meant. But I don't know, Brandon, what it was. There was something magical for me about that book. And it was this, obviously brilliant mind using very precise language, the language more of that I associated with the sciences, I suppose, speaking about these deep things about God. And it just fascinated me. Well, I had to return the book after, a couple weeks, whatever it was. And I found myself then going back. And I'd find it again and tuck it under my shirt, and I'd ride home with it. And I just was kind of making my way, trying to read these odd texts and think about them. I think I got Copleston's little paperback book on Aquinas around that time, and that helped me get an orientation to it, But it's a book that is, to call it interesting to me would be such an understatement. It was like something magical. And then, I think what it was, if I use that language of the acorn theory, when the person you're meant to be is sort of stirred in you when you're very young, and it just you just sing. It just strikes something. That's what it was like for me. When I was 14, I wanted to be a shortstop for the Cubs. I was interested in baseball above all sports. I was good in school, but school didn't captivate me or books. But I think the discovery of Aquinas' Summa was like the acorn stirring. And I sensed, even as a little kid, that I'd follow that trajectory, which indeed I have, to this moment, talking to you, that I became a priest and a theologian and a teacher and a writer and an evangelist. It all came from that. So that's why that's such a special book to me. And then obviously I've read it technically over many, many years, and I've done most of my academic work around it. And it's still a pierre de touche, as the French say. It's this touchstone for me. So yeah, I feel strongly about the Summa Theologiae.
Your story of the young teenage Robert Barron stumbling into the library and coming across that book and having it be a life-changing moment reminds me of the tale of the young J.R.R. Tolkien. And I'm probably getting a few of these details wrong, but apparently there's an episode, I think when he was an undergraduate, and he stumbled into a library and he came across this book of Icelandic linguistics, something so obscure and niche. But he said it was the most exhilarating experience coming across this book. It sent tingles through his body. The way he described it, it was the acorn theory on display. It was this is what that man was made for, and he followed that through Middle Earth. I
buy that. I think there's a lot to it. And I'd say through God's grace and God's providence, those things happen, where God just says, okay, this is the road I want you to be on. And again, I think of that room full of kids at Fenwick High School that all heard the same thing I heard, and it meant, probably next to nothing to them. Why did it mean that much to me? It's a mystery of providence, Why would that book of all books, have such an impact on me? It's providence.
You selected Thomas Aquinas for one of your pivotal players in your film series, and the criteria for selection for that series was people that not only impacted the church, but shaped the wider world, the wider culture. Talk about the significance and the impact of the Summa, not just on theologians, but how did it shape the last 700 years of history?
Well, I think anytime someone says faith and reason belong together, you see the heritage of Thomas Aquinas. No one in the great tradition sums that up. Now, other people would subscribe to it, of course, but I don't think anyone exemplifies it or sums it up better than Aquinas. So in that measure, he has a massive impact. Whenever a religious person thinks it's okay to think it through rationally, logically, philosophically, scientifically, so to that degree, I think he has this ongoing impact. In the life of the church, Thomas has ebbed and flowed over the centuries, at times having a huge impact, other times much less so. Some of his theses are condemned within a few years of his death, by bishops both in Paris and in England. During the centuries right after his death, it was the second part of the Summa that was most important. We associate probably the first part of the Summa with Aquinas, the arguments for God and God's attributes and creation. But it was the second part on the moral life because it so beguiled confessors and those doing the practical work of dealing with sinners. By the Council of Trent, they say on the desk of most of the Council Fathers, you had the Bible and you had the Summa of Aquinas. And then, of course, Ignatius and the Jesuits, because Ignatius has a huge interest in Aquinas. And then through the Jesuit institutions, Thomas's voice again resonates. More recently, late 19th century, with Leo XIII calling for a revival of Thomas studies. So he's ebbed and flowed up and down. Vatican II, Thomas is more conspicuous by his absence, I would say, in the text of Vatican II. I can testify the years after Vatican II, Thomas disappeared. I got him as a weird grace during those years. That was 1974 when I came across him. But he had mostly disappeared. But then, 1990s into the zeros, there's a Thomas revival going on. So anyway, I find that interesting how he reasserts himself, I think, because of the sheer quality and beauty of his thought. It never really goes away.
Let's close with this. How do you recommend people get into the Summa? I find a lot of people become attracted to Thomas when they hear people like you talk about him, and maybe they rush out and get that same volume from Mortimer Adler's Great Books of the Western World, and they crack it open, and it's immediately indecipherable. It's like someone wanting to get into the Bible, and they crack it open in Genesis and start trying to get into it. What do you recommend to first-timers who want to start reading the Summa? Yeah,
a couple things. Peter Kreeft's Summa of the Summa, I think, is a helpful way to get oriented. That Copleston book that helped me as a kid, simply called Aquinas by F.C. Copleston, is a good overview introduction. For the more lyrically minded, the great Chestertons, the Dumb Ox, his wonderful exploration of the life and writing of Aquinas. In a much more minor key, my own Thomas Aquinas Spiritual Master might be a way to get into it. Or think of Jean-Pierre Torel's, also called Thomas Aquinas Spiritual Master, isn't it? The 2-volume overview. I think of James Weisheipel's great biography of Aquinas as a way to get into his life. Those are all ways. So there are good commentaries and good introductions to Thomas. Start with that, maybe, and then dive in.
I'll add a couple more of my favorites. Brian Davies has a number of good books on Aquinas, and then Edward Fazer, our good friend out there in California, he has a good introduction. I think it's just called Aquinas, A Beginner's Guide, which walks you through some of his major ideas.
Good.
Okay, let's turn to your second favorite book, and I'm not sure if these are necessarily in any order. These are just the top 5 favorites, but the second one is The Divine Comedy by Dante. When did you first come across The Divine Comedy?
I know exactly. It was the summer of 1990, and I was a language student in Germany. So I had started my doctoral studies in Paris, but that summer I went to the Goethe Institute in Freiburg and Breisgau in southwest Germany. And I was living in this miserable dorm room. The kid who had lived there during the year had cleared out, but not totally. He'd left all this stuff behind, weird decorations, and it was like a weird college kid's room. That's where I was assigned to live. So I did my Goethe Institute all day, like 5-6 hours of nothing but German. And, reading, writing, listening, speaking German. I'd come home to that room. And so I brought with me, I forget why, I brought with me the little paperback volume of the Inferno of Dante. And I'd never read it. I'd never really read a word of Dante. I knew of him, of course, and how important he was. Never read him. So I remember, I can still kind of see myself lying on my stomach on this bed with the little paperback. And I began reading the Inferno as a little break from my hyper-intense German study. And it just, I don't know what it was about that particular translation or that time in my life or what, but it just began to sing to me like a novel. I read it with great interest, and the footnotes were good, and I would read the footnotes with great interest, and it got me into Dante. That's how I first came across him, and then that's just started this, since then, really lifelong process of reading him and reading about him.
Why do you think Dante has remained so enduring and beloved? I mean, it seems like he's right up there with Homer, Virgil, the author of Beowulf, and Dante. It's like, why him? Why this poem?
Because I think of Lord Kenneth Clark, during Civilization at one point, he says, "Is there sensuality in Dante? Of course there is. There's everything in Dante." I've always been struck by, that's right, there's everything in Dante. He's like one of those people that, all of life is in Dante. And then all of it under the aegis of the Catholic faith that, according to T.S. Eliot, the two great figures in all the Western literature, Dante and Shakespeare, and there's no third, says Eliot, that one of the two greatest writers in the West writes all about the Catholic faith, And so as a Catholic and as a lover of literature, it's this feast. And it's life. All of life is there, both natural and supernatural, told in the most compelling poetry. So that's a heady mix.
So you got this epic poem. It's spread across 3 different books, the Inferno, the Purgatorio, and the Paradiso. Do you have a favorite among those 3?
Yeah, probably like most people, the Inferno is probably the most fun to read, because his imagination can kind of go crazy. But in a way, as I taught Dante over the years and wrote about him, I became very attracted to the Purgatorio, the central one, because I think it's about the way a lot of us have to live the spiritual life, that we become aware of our sins, and then we enter into this process of purification. I find that it really sings to me as a spiritual person. Yes, I'm anticipating, with the grace of God, Paradiso, but even now, I can live the dynamics of the Purgatorio, and to me that makes it very interesting.
Let's turn to the next book. This one is The Seven-Story Mountain by Thomas Merton. We've spoken about this book a lot on this podcast. I remember the very first episode we did, which was covering Pope Francis's speech to Congress when he first visited America, and Pope Francis favorably mentioned Thomas Merton, and so that got us talking. But then we've talked about this title often. In fact, one of the reasons why we've created our own edition of it, a Word on Fire Classics edition, is because of how much this book has meant to you. So, by the way, if listeners are looking to get a beautiful version of this text, you can find it at wordonfireshow.com/Merton. But tell us the story once again, or maybe for the first time for those who haven't heard it, of how this book literally crashed into your life.
Yeah, I was working at Crocs and Brentano's bookstore in Oak Brook, Illinois. I was 16. My brother worked there too, and I was in the stock room in the back, and I was preparing, a lot of things. And there was a custom at the time, I forget why, but if a paperback got a little bit worn out, they could tear the cover off, and they'd sent the cover downtown, and then the book was just available. You could throw it out or give it to somebody. So anyway, my brother is back there with me, and I'm doing something. I'm filling out cards or something. And he throws this paperback to me, a coverless paperback, and it lands in my lap like this, and I catch it. And he goes, "Oh, you might like this. It's written by a Trappist monk." And I said, "Why would I want to read a book by some Buddhist?" And my brother said, "Trappists are Catholics, you idiot." And that's how the Seven-Story Mountain landed literally in my lap. And so I took it home, and mind you, I'm 16, so I'd had the Thomas Aquinas experience at 14. I'd begun my kind of clandestine reading of these arcane religious texts. I'm kind of getting interested in the whole religious thing. Well, then I pick up this book, which is brilliantly written by this man who had trained to be a writer, who was a man of the world in every sense of that term, and who then went through this extraordinary process of conversion to religion, to Catholicism, and then eventually becomes a Trappist monk, like the most intense kind of monk you can become. Well, it's a captivatingly romantic story. And I use that word on purpose because I think it's a story about someone falling in love with God and told in such a compelling way. So you're 16. You're right at this kind of romantic period of life, you know what I mean? And I was getting interested in religion, and here's this book about falling in love with God in this radical way. Well, it just sang to my heart. Where Aquinas, the first Thomas, was really singing to my head and clarifying a lot of things. Merton, who's no slouch intellectually, mind you, but began singing to other aspects of my being, you know, and to see this life given totally to God. Here's something funny, Brandon. When I was reading that book, so I'm 16, 1976 approximately, I had just discovered the Beatles. So the Beatles break up in 1970, but I kind of discover them as I'm discovering music and everything else. And to this day, if one of the classic Beatles songs comes on, it triggers Merton in my mind, because I remember reading The Seven Storey Mountain while I am listening to, you know, Hey Jude or to Let It Be or to, you know, the great Beatles songs. So my point there is that it just began to work its way into my consciousness, you know, very deeply.
You know, if you go to most Catholic bookstores today, you'll see a whole section dedicated to conversion stories. It's like a whole industry.
Yeah.
We have so many good stories, you know, all the way back from Augustine's Confessions to Newman's Apologia. You have, you know, more contemporary ones
Dorothy
like Scott
Day.
Hahn's Rome Sweet Home, The
Right.
Long Loneliness of Dorothy Day. What sets Thomas Merton's story apart from all these other memoirs of conversion?
Well, it's not unlike Augustine's, because I mean Augustine is a sublime writer and an extremely brilliant theologian. Something similar with Merton. It was Fulton Sheen who compared the Seven Storey Mountain to the Confessions of Augustine, and there's a lot to that. Merton brings his religious sensibility, but also the great sensibility of a writer, because he was training really to be a novelist, to be a poet. In fact, he's quite a fine poet, published quite widely after he became a Trappist. But I think it's that combination. It's told with such psychological perception and such a novelist gift for the description of the time and place. It's full of humanity. Merton is you know, like all of us, kind of a conflicted figure and, you know, full of light and darkness, and he's kind of honest about all of that. I think that makes it very compelling. It's a writer's tale. You know who else really admired The Seven Storey Mountain was Evelyn Waugh. So Waugh writes one of the early kind of reviews of it for a British public, and in fact, I think he writes the preface to the British edition of it.
I think he helped edit it too as well. He helped shape it.
And gave it the title. It's not called Seven Storey Mountain, but rather Elected Silence, which is a line from a Jared Manley Hopkins poem. So Waugh caught all of that. In fact, when did that come out, Brandon? A couple years ago, this wonderful little book of the letters between Waugh and Merton. Because starting back then, we're this sort of elder statesman. By that time, Waugh would have been in his, 40s or 50s. And he's giving Merton, who's a pretty young man when he wrote The Seven Storey Mountain, kind of writerly advice about how, you know, he should do this and that and change this. But he had a great admiration for The Seven Storey Mountain. So I think it's the writerly quality, the perception, the psychological perceptiveness, as well as the rich spirituality.
So again, if you haven't read Seven Storey Mountain, you might consider getting the Word on Fire Classics edition. It's a beautiful version of it. It's got an introduction by Bishop Barron himself. So find it at wordonfireshow.com/Merton. All right, next up is Moby Dick by Herman Melville. Now this might be a little surprising from some people, I think. Why this book? How did it impact you? How are you different for having read it?
Oh my gosh. I think, as I remember now with this, we propose like genre, you know, so the Summa is my favorite book of theology, Merton is probably like spirituality, Dante, poetry. I think Moby Dick I chose for fiction. I love that book. I've read it in its entirety, I think 3 times. and studied it and read about it quite a bit. When did I first read it? I don't remember. I don't have that same kind of vivid memory when I first read it. I think, in fact, I tried the first time and only got a certain distance. And when Melville goes into 50 pages of describing the whaling techniques, But at the right point in my life, I got through it and loved it. You know that line, I think it's Dr. Johnson's line about if you're bored with London, you're bored with life. And there's like Dante too. Moby Dick, if you're bored with that book, you're bored with life. Because here's this genius. I think Melville I think he's the greatest of the American fiction writers. At this key point in his life, he retired to a little log cabin. And for an intense year, produced this novel, the greatest American novel. And it broke him. He never recovered from it psychologically. He writes Billy Budd and some of these wonderful shorter pieces, but he never recovered from it. It's like Bertrand Russell with North Whitehead when they wrote the Principia Mathematica. He was a very young man, and Russell said, but it broke my mind. I could never operate at that level again. And Russell wrote extensively till he was in his 90s, but he said he never reached that level. And that's true, he never did. Melville's similar. It's like he poured his entire self into this book, and it's filled with life, friendship and hatred and rivalry and obsession and jealousy and religion and sex and fate and nature. It's like, all of it is there in this great book. One way in, I often compare when I would teach Dante, compare the beginning of the Divine Comedy with the beginning of Moby Dick, because they're both dealing with relatively young men who are in a kind of suicidal depression and have to go through this wrenching journey to find the way out. In Dante's case, the journey through hell, purgatory, and heaven. In Melville's case, this sea journey, with Captain Ahab and all the people on that little ship, the Pequod. But they're both journey stories about a young man trying to make his way from one rather, like when Melville says, when it's a dreary November in your soul. That's how Moby Dick begins. Now it's time to go to sea, So they're adventure stories that are about external adventures, but really about the inner adventure. What do I love about it? I mean, look at Captain Ahab. Melville was reading a lot of Shakespeare at the time. We know that. And boy, you can hear it in someone like Captain Ahab, this famously tragic figure. But listen to his speeches. When Ahab speaks, it's like Macbeth. It's like Hamlet. It's like Henry V. I mean, it's full of Shakespearean angst and so on. What's he after? He's after the white whale, the most famous symbol in all of American literature, no question about it. What's the white whale? Well, it's nature, it's fate, it's whatever. But as I read Moby Dick, I can't help but think the white whale is evocative of God. Are we obsessed with God? Yes, and searching to find God. But is there the danger? Ahab enters into this struggle, this battle with God, a bit like Jacob and the angel, right? And just as the angel wounds Jacob, so the whale wounds Ahab, rips his leg off, But now Ahab comes with even greater fury. Mind you, Ahab named for the worst of Israel's kings, right? So whoever gave him that name. But now he's coming after, with fury after God. But God cannot be conquered that way. And by the end of the story, of course, Moby Dick rises up from the depths and destroys the ship and kills Ahab. And I think it's, now again, from a typically American Protestant perspective. So you're not dealing with Dante. That's a very Catholic imagination. With Melville, you're into a Protestant space. But this furious struggle with God, I think, is at the heart of that story. So anyway, I could go on and on about Moby Dick, but it is the great American novel.
Well, I'm utterly shocked to hear that you've read the whole thing 3 times.
Oh,
I know
gosh.
for most people,
Yeah.
once is a lifetime accomplishment for
But then
that book.
you got to go back, though, and then you really begin to see it, No, it's marvelous.
How about some advice for people that get bogged down in the numerous details about, whaling biology, whale oil harvesting, all that stuff?
Maybe skip it. If you're getting super bored, just skip it and get to the narrative again. That's okay. Part of it, Brandon, too, it's interesting. Remember Umberto Eco, when he commences The Name of the Rose, and you have these long, long sections about monastic life? He said, I had to put my reader through his own novitiate. In other words, that was meant to be boring. It was meant to be like, because he was drawing you into the world of this monastery. And it's only in that monastery that you're going to get the story. Tolkien, famously, with Bilbo's endless birthday party at the beginning of Lord of the Rings. And like, why am I going through this birthday party? He had to get you into his world, right? Well, same with Moby Dick. That's why you're, about how the oil comes out of the whale and the cutting its head off and how you, but you're meant to be drawn into this obsessive world of this whaling ship. But if that's not working for you the first time through, skip it and get to the sea adventure.
You're getting awfully close to triggering my Tolkien sensibilities by implying that there's a boring line in Tolkien, but we'll let that pass for now.
Don't say Bilbo's 111st birthday party. People are like, why is he going on and on about this birthday party? Can't we get to the, rollicking adventure of this story? Which, of course, he does. But he had to put you through a novitiate, I think, at the beginning.
All right, let's look to the fifth and final book, and this was written by the great William Shakespeare, who you mentioned had formed the mind of Herman Melville, and it's his great play, Macbeth. So first of all, why do you set this play above all the other Shakespearean dramas?
Oh, I don't know. And, again, some of that is kind of arbitrary. How could you not see Hamlet as one of the, monuments of the human spirit? Maybe it's because I first came across Shakespeare in high school. I think when I was a freshman, we read Romeo and Juliet. That was probably the first thing I ever read. And, I've told people it's like my discovery of Aquinas at the same age when I was 14. I didn't understand Romeo and Juliet. I understood, the basic lines of it. But my reaction at that time was that there should be such a thing. You know what I mean? That such a thing should exist, I thought was marvelous. Like, what is this? These words and the complexity of it. Well, I think a little bit later in high school, maybe junior year, we read Macbeth. And we might have even, as I remember, kind of quasi-acted it out. I think we kind of, And so it was one of my earliest exposures to Shakespeare was through Macbeth. And I don't know. My good friend Ed Oakes, who died way too young, the great father Ed Oakes, Balthazar scholar, he and I used to go to the Shakespeare Theater in Chicago on Navy Pier, which is beautiful, specially constructed theater for Shakespeare. And he and I would go down, we'd have dinner together, and then we'd go to the play. And I remember one night we were going to go see, it was a Hamlet production. And he said, I just want to close my eyes and let the language wash over me. And that's kind of, with Shakespeare, it's the language. I've just been watching, all during the COVID thing, the great Patrick Stewart reading all the Shakespeare sonnets every day. And, the Shakespeare sonnets are so complex that you're not like, oh, yeah, I got it. Mm-hmm. It's all figured out. It's not so much that. The first time you hear it, it's let the language and its rhythms and its color. So Macbeth had that impact on me. But then, like Moby Dick, like the Divine Comedy, all of life is there. The psychological perception, the wrestling with, Thomas talks about wealth, pleasure, power, and honor. Well, they're all there, aren't they? With Macbeth, it's largely power and honor, probably. But how a human being deals with the greatest temptations, and no one articulates those dynamics better than Shakespeare. Thomas can name them in his sort of abstract scholastic vocabulary. Shakespeare lets you feel it, and you enter with the greatest depth of perception into the texture of that experience. So anyone that's ever felt the tug of ambition or the tug of power, what I wouldn't do to get what I want, even though I know it's the wrong thing, but enter into that play and it'll remind you of what's going on in your own psychology, That's what Shakespeare, I think, does better than almost anybody. Anyway, I could go on and on about Shakespeare.
it's often been recommended that people, instead of reading Shakespeare, watch it
Yeah.
performed. That's the way it's intended. Do you
Absolutely.
have a favorite performance
Yeah.
of Macbeth you like?
Yeah, I do, and I'm glad you asked about that because it's the famous one from the 70s, a very young Ian McKellen, long before he's Gandalf the Grey, and the great Dame Judi Dench. But when they're quite young, they're probably in their early 30s maybe, and it was a production by Trevor Nunn, who was a famous director of Shakespeare at the time, also a young man. And they did it in this dark, just a dark space with the simplest sort of setting, nothing to distract your attention. They wore the simplest, most understated clothes. You know who was in that production too? The man who eventually played the Emperor in Star Wars. It plays the porter in that famous scene where they're knock, 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 and the porter opens the door. Well, anyway, that production, you get it on YouTube, they said they wanted nothing to distract from the language. And you had these two sublime actors, McKellen and Judi Dench, doing Macbeth and Lady Macbeth. And just watching their interaction in those famous speeches is stunning. So, yeah, that's my favorite production of Macbeth.
Well, we'll be sure to link to all of these book recommendations in the show notes. And again, if you want the full list of all of Bishop Barron's favorite books, there's dozens more that we have on the PDF. You can find it at wordonfireshow.com/books. Well, it's time now for our question from one of our listeners. Today we have one from Alexandria. She's a new convert to the Catholic faith from Vancouver, Canada. And she has a really interesting question about something she found in Aquinas' writing that she wants clarification about. Here's her question.
Hi, Bishop Barron. My name is Alexandria, and I'm a new Catholic from Vancouver, Canada. Aquinas was really instrumental in my conversion, but I was disappointed that in his articles on the production of woman, he speaks repeatedly of women's defectiveness and inferiority. I recognize the language of Aristotelian reproductive biology here, and I know how much Aristotle would have influenced Aquinas. So my question is, did Aquinas really believe women were inferior or defective? And if so, would modern Catholic theologians disagree now that Aristotelian biology has been mostly disproven? Thank you.
Yes and yes. So you're absolutely right. I mean, the instincts behind your question are right. Namely, that Thomas was very influenced by Aristotle, both in Aristotle's science, his physics, and his metaphysics. Are we obliged, to subscribe now to the physics and sort of medical theorizing of Aristotle? Absolutely not. Was Aristotle, and therefore Thomas, wrong about their conception of women? Yeah, absolutely. And we're not the least bit beholden to those views. Are there metaphysical insights in Aristotle that remain of perennial value? Yeah, and that's what I think what remains most important. But the science and medical sort of physics of Aristotle, no, we're not obliged to hold to that. And no Catholic is obliged to hold those views of Aquinas in that manner. And it speaks to a wider point, too. As I reverence Thomas Aquinas, as you well know, it doesn't mean that Thomas Aquinas is somehow infallible or that every little thing Thomas said about any subject is ipso facto correct. Well, of course not. That's true of nobody in the great tradition. Augustine, right about everything? Come on. There's nobody in the great tradition who's right about everything. So no, don't feel the least bit obligated to hold to those, clearly, by our lights now, silly and erroneous views of Aquinas on women.
Well, thanks so much for listening and watching to this episode of the show. Before we go, I wanted to shout out some of our special patrons who support this show and make it happen. Lucy Kaysen from Prairieville, Louisiana, Rosemary Parker from Oswego, New York, Ethereal Matter, I'm guessing that's a pseudonym, from Cincinnati, Ohio, and Maria Sostak from Spring Lake, Michigan. Thank you guys. Thanks so much for making this show happen, for supporting us. If you like this show, maybe, we're on episode, 259. Maybe you've been listening for a long time and you like it, you want to get it out to more people, consider supporting the show and becoming a patron. You can do that at wordonfireshow.com/patron. Thanks so much for listening. We'll see you next time on the Word on Fire Show.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, I encourage you to share it and be sure to subscribe to my YouTube channel.